Welcome to this video on the Plessy vs. Ferguson mock trial, hosted by the World Affairs Council of Austin. This case examined the constitutionality of racial segregation laws in the United States. Plessy vs. Ferguson was a criminal prosecution in 1892 against Homer Plessy for violating Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890. Plessy's arrest was deliberately orchestrated by the Citizens Committee to challenge segregation laws. Louisiana's Separate Car Act required railroads to provide, quote, equal but separate accommodations. Plessy, a mixed-race man who could pass as white, purchased a first-class ticket and sat in the whites-only car as a planned test case. Plessy was charged in state criminal court. His lawyers argued the law was unconstitutional, but Judge Ferguson denied their petition and upheld the law. Plessy was convicted, and his legal team began the appeal process, ultimately reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. Homer Plessy was an activist taking a calculated move by the Comité des Citoyens to test the constitutionality of racial segregation. He was charged with violating the Separate Car Act of 1890, a misdemeanor punishable by a $20 fine. This section covers the prosecution's side in the Homer Plessy trial. The state of Louisiana argued that it had the authority under its police power to regulate railroads. They claimed the law required separation, not inequality, and did not violate the 14th Amendment. The state classified passengers by race to preserve public order. The prosecution's top arguments included the, quote, police power defense, asserting state authority over public order. They also claimed the, quote, separate but equal doctrine fulfilled constitutional equality, and that segregation was a necessary social tool to manage racial tensions. Key witnesses for the prosecution included the conductor, Christopher Kane, who arrested Plessy, and Judge John H. Ferguson, who confirmed Plessy's deliberate violation. Clerk Daniel F. Ring established the railway's segregation policy. Louis A. Martinet and Albion W. Tourget, activists involved in planning the test case, also testified. State witnesses confirmed that Plessy deliberately entered the wrong car despite the clear segregation policy. Martinet's testimony established Plessy's action as part of a larger, planned challenge. Tourget, Plessy's lawyer, also served as a witness. He helped plan the challenge and argued the law imposed a badge of servitude on black citizens, confirming Plessy was chosen as the ideal test case. Conductor Kane testified that Plessy violated the segregation law. His testimony supported the state's case by establishing Plessy's deliberate action against the Separate Car Act. Judge Ferguson testified for the prosecution, confirming Plessy intentionally entered the white car. His testimony underscored the deliberate nature of the violation. Ferguson later became the defendant in the appeal. Louis Martinet, a surprising prosecution witness, admitted that Plessy's action was a planned conspiracy. This testimony established the deliberate nature of Plessy's challenge to the state law. Clerk Ring established the railway's clear segregation policy, which was communicated to passengers. His testimony showed the railroad's compliance efforts, undermining Plessy's claim of being unaware of the law. The state's arguments upheld the law, claiming the Separate Car Act was a constitutional and reasonable exercise of police power. They argued that segregation laws were acceptable for social regulation to maintain public order and safety. The legal team cited precedents such as the Dred Scott case from 1857, rulings regarding the Civil Rights Acts, and previous 14th Amendment cases. Arguments relied on precedents defining involuntary servitude. Next, we will cover the defense of Homer Plessy in the mock trial. The defense argued the Separate Car Act violated both the 13th Amendment by imposing a, quote, badge of servitude and the 14th Amendment by denying equal protection. They asserted racial classification was unconstitutional and segregation stigmatized black citizens. The defense's top arguments centered on Plessy's case as a legal challenge to injustice, a catalyst for civil rights progress, and a symbol of collective resistance. They aimed to expose the illusion of equality and initiate a moral reckoning with history. The defense's key witnesses included Homer Plessy, Dr. Duncan B. Kenner, a white intellectual, Dr. James H. Caldwell, a prominent black physician, Professor John L. Boudreau, a historian, and Professor W.R. Devine, an engineer. Plessy's lawyers argued the Separate Car Act violated the 13th Amendment by imposing involuntary servitude and the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The state countered that the law was a reasonable exercise of police power. Homer Plessy testified that his action was intentional, a deliberate test case to force a legal showdown. His goal was to frame the case as a philosophical battle for rights, highlighting the absurdity of the segregation law. Dr. Kenner, a key white defense witness and former Confederate officer turned abolitionist, testified that segregation increased racial tensions and was an anachronism. His testimony challenged the all-white jury's expectations. Dr. Caldwell, a prominent black physician, testified about the deep harm of segregation. He argued that it stripped dignity from black Americans, highlighting the lived trauma of racial separation for the defense. Professor Boudreau, a history professor, testified that the segregation law had unnatural and reactionary origins. He argued that racial separation was a recent invention, not a natural order. Professor Devine, an engineer, offered a practical critique of the law's logistics. He argued that enforcing separate cars caused chaos and inefficiency, exposing the law's impracticality. Plessy's defense arguments claimed the Separate Car Act was unconstitutional. They cited the 13th Amendment against involuntary servitude and the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The Citizens Committee, a multiracial organization of black civic leaders in New Orleans, orchestrated the entire Plessy test case. They deliberately planned Plessy's arrest to challenge segregation laws. Judge Ferguson ultimately denied Plessy's writ of prohibition, upholding the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act. The state law was deemed a reasonable police power, and Plessy was convicted and fined. Following his conviction, Plessy's legal team immediately began the appeals process. The case moved through the Louisiana state court system, with Plessy's ultimate appeal directed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Plessy's conviction was appealed through the Louisiana courts, where the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld the state law. This ruling affirmed the legality of segregated rail travel, leading to the final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The legal team, led by Albion W. Tourget, strategically planned the appeal to the Supreme Court. They cited violations of both the 13th and 14th Amendments, arguing the law imposed a badge of involuntary servitude. The defense argued the 13th Amendment was violated because the Separate Car Act imposed involuntary servitude on black citizens. They claimed the law created a badge of servitude and violated the freedom of movement. Plessy's defense cited the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, arguing the Separate Car Act implied the legal inferiority of one race. The state maintained the law was reasonable social regulation. Albion W. Tourget led the legal team, strategically planning the entire test case. They argued the law imposed a badge of involuntary servitude and denied Plessy equal protection under the law. Thank you for watching this video on the Plessy v. Ferguson mock trial.